Good evening, y'all, and welcome to this Chapter 3 reading of Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. It's been a pleasure getting through this reading with y'all, and as always, thank y'all for joining us. If you're here in the live reading and you don't have a physical copy of the book, we got you covered. That book is going to be as a PDF in the pinned section of the Neo-colonialism channel here in the Discord. And as always, if you're following along on YouTube and not in the live reading, you can access that PDF from the description of the YouTube video. So let me go to chapter 3, and then without any further ado, we can get started. So chapter 3, Imperialist Finance. These are the hard facts of the African situation today. A process that has continued and grown since the invasion of Africa by the European and foreign powers. It has gained tremendous momentum in recent years with the growth of the struggle between the imperialist antagonists and between capitalism and socialism. Imperialism was analyzed by Lenin as the highest stage of capitalism. His exposition was written in the middle of the First World War, 1916, which was waged to determine the first major revision of imperialist supremacy. He traced the unequal development of capitalism, which caused the latecomers like Germany and the United States to form into cartels and syndicates before the earlier starters, and so brought them sooner to a higher stage of monopoly from which they challenged each other and the rest of the world of imperialism. Monopoly capitalism by means of mergers, amalgamations, patent agreements, selling arrangements, production quotas, price fixing, and a variety of other common contrivances can build itself into an international confraternity. However, because of its competitive character rooted in the principle of production for private gain and the unequal development of capitalism, the struggle of the monopolies went on within the international combinations. The conflicts between the European and American financial and industrial trusts and combines for a redivision of the world's resources, of raw materials and markets for investment capital and manufactured goods, exploded into war when they became too intense to contain within the limits of the diplomacy. The 1914 to 1918 war brought a redivision of the globe's colonial sectors. At the same time, it created the opportunity for a socialist break in the chain of imperialism that encircled the world. A heavy blow was dealt to international monopoly capitalism with the triumph of the Russian October Revolution. From then on, it was faced not only with the struggle for hegemony within its own ranks, but, which was much worse, it was forced to engage in a defensive struggle against an opposing ideology. That ideology had achieved a signal success in withdrawing a sixth of the Earth's surface from monopoly capitalism's field of operation, a fact which it has never and will never forgive, and was threatening to undermine imperialism's power at other strategic spots which had softened under the blows of war. With the failure of interventionist war to subdue the new socialist state, a cordon sanitaire was raised around the Soviet Union to prevent the spread of socialist contamination to other parts of Europe. Fascism was encouraged to prop capitalism at points where it had been seriously damaged and was faced with popular discontent, as in Germany and Italy, and to bolster it in those outposts which were and remain semi-colonial appendages to Western imperialism, Spain and Portugal. These devices, however, were unable to cope with the current crises that were tearing at the very heart of capitalism and sharpening the bitter contentions between rival imperialisms, which erupted into a second global war in 1939. From this Holocaust, socialism emerged as a much more threatening challenge to imperialism than ever before. At the same time, we, the people of imperialism's far-flung empires, had come to realize that we could have control over our own destiny and began to make our bid for independent nationhood. Thus, imperialism came to be challenged on another front, the colonialist front, at a time when science had heightened the capabilities of the productive machinery of capitalism, thereby increasing its need for the raw materials and markets for new chemically produced primary materials, manufactured goods, and overseas employment of growing capital surpluses. Challenged thus by anti-colonialism and socialism, imperialism is now engaged in a to-the-death trial for the survival against the forces that are antagonistic to it and that are building up across the globe, even while the internecine struggle within itself is becoming more and more brutal. In this multi-sided struggle, imperialism has been forced into the use of many surfaces or into the use of many artifices to maintain itself in being by continuing the colonialist process without the benefit of colonial control. The great colonial powers were able to monopolize external trade in agricultural and industrial primary materials production in their respective subject territories. The colonies of such a lesser industrialized nation as Portugal, however, which has for centuries been a pawn of Britain and became semi-colony of British finance, were dominated by British capital. together with the international banking groups with which it is associated. Belgian financial domination of the Congo, because of the close connections of Belgian banking institutions with such international houses as Rothschild, Lazard Frères, and Schroeder, in their turn, linked with the Morgan and Rockefeller groups, was shared with British, French, and American finance. And Comrade Dictionary has posted the definition of entering the scene in the chat, which means destructive to both sides in a conflict. Thank you, my esteemed Comrade Dictionary. You make Merriam-Webster look like an amateur. All right, so the tribute drawn off by way of colonial and semi-colonial exploitation enabled the capitalist classes of the metropolitan countries to pass some of their crumbs to their working classes and thereby buy them off, especially the trade union and political leaders. When the class conflicts in their societies got critical. At the same time, the competition for sources of raw materials and the export of capital and commodities intensified as productive methods improved and goods came out of the factories on a more and more massive scale. The uneven development of capitalism brought new contenders into the field who joined in the rivalries that had grown up with the original scramble for colonies. These deepened until they erupted in the two world wars, which, notwithstanding all the pious claptrap about there being wars fought for the maintenance of democracy, were in reality wars fought for the redivision of the world by monopoly capitalism. No, he's spitting. So I guess the spreading democracy lie has been around for longer than I could ever conceive of. I always thought that was like a neoliberal pivot to like continue justifying these, like, in some cases, century-old conflicts. But I guess, no, this democracy lie has been around for a while. War, Clausewitz has told us, is the continuation of policy by other means. What the powerful trusts were unable to achieve by peaceful competition, their domination over larger and larger areas of the world, they embroiled their countries into military action to achieve for them. This not only gives them a wider sphere of exclusive operation, but undermines the power of competing monopolies. This redivision of the world is not confined to the less developed sectors, but extends to highly industrialized areas. The important industrialized region of Alsace-Lorraine was a coveted prize of the German invasions of France in the war of 1871 and 1939. Hitler's campaign against Czechoslovakia was inspired by the desire to annex the highly developed manufactories of Bohemia and Moravia to the German trust. French capitalists long looked with watering mouths at the rich coal mines and chemical and other industries of the Saar, so close to the iron ore range of Lorraine, and seized the opportunity of the 1919 peace arrangements to appropriate them to France as a reparations award. A later plebiscite won the Saar back to Germany. After the Second World War, agreement between the Duendo-Schneider Trust achieved a customs union between the German state of the Saar and France, which actually makes the Saar a dependency of the Duendo coal and steel empire. Comrade Dictionary has posted the definition of plebiscite: the direct vote of the members of an electorate on an important public question, such as change to the Constitution. Thank you, esteemed Comrade Dictionary. Merriam-Webster had nothing on you. All right, so World War II ended in the defeat of Hitler and a temporary rebuff to German capitalism, which had to submit to a revitalizing injection of American monopoly finance. At the same time, an upheaval was taking place in the colonial world, such as to make Winston Churchill remark that he had not been made Prime Minister of Britain to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. All the fair, brave words spoken about freedom that had been broadcast to the four corners of the earth took seed and grew where they had not been intended. Colonial emancipation became the dominating phenomenon of the mid-20th century, just as abolition of slavery was of the corresponding period of the 19th, with just as crucial consequences in national and international politics and economics. Post-war capitalism, which had already received one devastating blow after the First World War and the rise of the Soviet Union, took another crushing defeat in the establishment of socialist regimes in a number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in China. Large sources of raw materials and financial investment in commodity markets were withdrawn from its field of exploitation. Domestic reconstruction at first occupied the attention of the European countries. The United States, having already achieved a tremendous head start by its late intervention into the war, its physical immunity from attack, and the enormous spurt given to its productive and inventive capacity as a main supplier of war materials and services, took over from Britain the leading role in international financial monopoly. You know, one thing that that's like being hammered home for me, and obviously I already understood and knew it, but it's just bearing repeating, is like how the function of economy itself is a social relation, and not just what we're building too, socialism and eventually communism, but even capitalism and itself, imperialism is a social relation between the bourgeois here we have Nkrumah talking about commodity markets and financial investment, and he's talking about crushing the feet of socialist regimes or socialist regimes causing crushing defeats to capitalists, but that necessarily means that like any kind of like bourgeois influences that the bourgeois of other countries were having relationships with, maybe these necessarily means that these relationships are beginning to crumble. They're not necessarily being able to engage economically in the way they want to. The level of exploitation is being leveled to be something way closer to like fairer. He talked about a sixth of the globe having surrendered itself to socialism after World War I, I think he said. So yeah, thinking about imperialism as a social relation between the bourgeoisie, just as like the project to build socialism, and which is decolonization, that's also a social relation. That's not something that I've ever really begun to develop that much in my mind, because I just always assumed that was a basic statement of fact. But that's actually like a powerful way to like get into like exactly how it is that these bourgeois execute their exploitation of the global working class. So that's a thought that I've had as I've been reading through this. Continuing on. As a result of its primacy in the financial sphere, United States foreign policy turned in a completely opposite direction from its pre-war position of splendid isolation to one of domination in world affairs. The outcropping of new states from colonial submergence raised the pivotal problem of how to retain these countries within the colonial relationship once open control was removed. Thus has opened up a new phase of imperialism, that of the adaptation of colonialism to the new condition of the elimination of political overlordship of colonial powers, a phase in which colonialism is to be maintained by other means. This is not to say that the old outright form of colonialism is completely scrapped. There is plenty of evidence to show how tenaciously imperial powers cling to their colonial territories. Vietnam, Korea, Suez, Algeria are all examples of how far imperialist nations will go to hold on physically to colonies, an attitude reinforced by the interference of America as a leading protagonist in the struggle for the world monopolist control of finance capital. This struggle has been given an ideological content by invoking anti-communism as the mainspring of the battle to spring the socialist sector of the globe back into the exploitative control of Western financial monopoly. Cuba is the outstanding example of the extremist lengths to which these powers will go in the effort to reimpose their grip where they have been ejected and to maintain what they consider a strategic bastion in the struggle for the renewal of dominion over the socialist anti-imperialism. Control of fuel resources is a prime motivator in the frantic competition between monopolies. The sword was bandied between France and Germany because of its important coal resources. Similarly, the battle for oil has gone on since before the First World War. Yeah, exactly, blood for oil. Middle Eastern oil, in fact, became an important objective of that war. And the struggle continued after the war by diplomatic and economic means inside the national boundaries and on the international plane. Rockefeller's supremacy in oil has been stoutly contested by the Morgan groups, which have extended their influence by breaking into the Anglo-Dutch holdings, a one-time preserve of the Rothschilds, Lazard Flares, and the Deutsche Bank and their associates. So that's another thing that just interests me, because like he's talking about just how far these people are willing to go in order to like reestablish a grip on colonies that they formerly held in order to get like the fangs of imperialism back into the country. And he's talking about how, he's obviously giving reference to the sanctions and the like blockades that have been going on and imposed on Cuba. But it makes you think like what in today's context would be meant if somebody were to say they're willing to go that far, etc. And you start thinking about the fact that like these imperialist powers quite literally have nuclear missiles. And then you start thinking about like, well, shit. What is their like relationship to like colonized countries or like at the very least anti-imperialist countries who have nukes and who are not at all afraid to engage in a hostile way against the U.S. And then you start to be able to then contextualize why it is the U.S. gets so goddamn angry and so goddamn salty about like, the DPRK and like its development toward these kinds of having these kinds of weapons, can't ever leverage those kinds of weapons against a country that can leverage using them against you all over again, and like they must be looking at the DPRK as having some kind of audacity, to do some shit like that. But you know me, God bless the DPRK for even being able to continue to exist under these conditions. Yak says, reminds me of Marjane Satrapi's memoir, Persepolis. She's an Iranian-born artist and writer who lives in France. In the 80s, she remembered her dad saying, "As long as the Middle East has oil, we will never have peace." She was around 10 or so when her dad said that to her. Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately about imperialistic control over all the resources. So yeah, as long as there's anything for these colonizers to extract and steal and exploit, they'll be literally occupying the rest of the world forever, unless, of course, we give them a little revolution as a treat. So the frenzied battle for oil monopoly has been a cardinal factor in the suppression of popular movements in colonial and semi-colonial areas of the Near, Middle, and Far East in Latin America and North Africa. The series of events in Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Aden, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, Brunei, and Algeria that have erupted in violence, revolution, and war have been largely stimulated by the struggle for control of oil. Oil finds in European centers such as Groningen and Holland have drawn the competition into well-industrialized centers, just as the competition from coal and iron did. Competition between the oil combines is not confined to production, but extends into the distribution of petroleum products and the new byproduct industry of petrochemicals. A fierce struggle is going on all over the world as a result of the sharp increase in the quantity of oil consumed and the territorial expansion of consumption. The oil industry has from its outset been dominated by the most powerful banking interests, the Rockefellers, Morgans, Rothschilds, because of the spiraling profits it provides. Today, even with the larger royalties the oil combines have been obliged to pay to the oil-producing countries, their profits are still mounting prodigiously. Oil trust reserves run into billions. Much has been used in investments abroad, America far and away exceeding all others. To financial reserves from oil must be added those amassed from metal and other raw material monopolies. For monopoly, food supplies and vast industrial and agricultural empires. From the monopoly network of distribution and distributive agencies, from military preparations and the several wars that have been fought with colonial peoples since the end of the Second World War, from the development of nuclear instruments of destruction and the frenzied race for leadership in the realm of space research. Capitalism contains many paradoxes, all of them based on the concept of commodity production, the few rich and the many poor. Poverty and hunger amid superabundance, freedom from hunger, campaigns and subsidies for restriction of crop output. But perhaps the most ludicrous is the constant traffic in the same kinds of goods, products, and commodities between countries. Everyone is busy, as it were, taking in the other's washing. This is not done out of need, but out of the compulsion of profit-making and monopoly extension. The European common market has become the apotheosis of this process, as well as the dumping ground of international investment dominated by the giant American banking concerns and their British satellites. The European community, of which the European common market is only one aspect, is by no means a new concept. It was foreshadowed by Hobson in his critique of imperialism as a European federation of great powers which, so far from forwarding the cause of world civilization, might introduce the gigantic peril of Western parasites as a group of advanced industrial nations whose upper classes drew vast tribute from Asia and Africa, with which they supported great masses of retainers no longer engaged in the staple industries of agriculture and manufacture, but kept in the performance of personal or minor industrial services under the control of a new financial aristocracy. It is collective imperialism. And Comrade Dictionary, praise be his name, has put the definition of apotheosis in the chat, which is the highest point in the development of something, culmination or climax. The appearance as Hamlet was the apotheosis of his career. Thank you, Comrade Dictionary. Nobody defines words quite like you do. Let's see. This is precisely what has happened. Competition between the monopolies has produced a phenomenon of vast advertising and public relations organizations which busy themselves selling not only goods and services, but personalities as well. These organizations and the media through which they operate, the press, radio, cinema, television, and the businesses dealing with the packaging of goods, employ huge armies of people in what are nothing more than parasitic jobs which would have no place in a sane society producing for consumption instead of profit. As things are, enormous sums are invested and earned by the financial interests that participate in the promotion of these enterprises. But this is only a tiny facet of the fevered financial activity which is going on today in the capitalist world. Every week, every day, which with almost monotonous regularity, we see the same names repeating themselves as bidders for large companies, as underwriters and issuers of new shares or holders of debentures, as combiners in new financial institutions for more universal methods of investment. as participants in new factories and ventures that will extend monopoly in fresh directions and more territories. They are especially industrious in the countries of the Six and others which still hope to push into the common market as direct or associate members. The lowering of trade barriers was the signal for their entry. For practical purposes, some of the key European countries are financial servants of the dominant banking monopolist groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers. Despite all the power pertaining to such important banks as the Société Générale de Belgique, Banque de Bruxelles, Crédit Bank, Banque Lauder, to such important industrial finance groups as Solvay, Boel, Rufina Cofinedis, Petrofina Belgium, with its appendage Luxembourg, is in reality a financial colony of American investment capital. 39 new companies were established in Belgium in 1959 by foreigners. In the year 1961, the number of new foreign companies set up had grown to 237. God damn. What the hell is happening in that country at that time? Sums invested from abroad had swollen from 2.4 million Belgian francs in 1959 to 6.6 million Belgian francs in 1961. Of this last figure, almost 60%, that is 3.9 million, Belgian francs was furnished from American sources. Henry Costin, in his revealing book on the ramifications of banking finance, L'Europe des Banquiers, declares that this enterprise is not limited to the territory of the kingdom, and that the Belgian ex-colonies have not been ignored. One might even ask if the sanguinary events in the Congo were not caused by the merciless struggle going on between rival financial groups, he concludes. American finance capital, of course, had a field day in Germany during the post-war occupation. Germany industry and finance, already linked to American industry and finance by cartel and trust arrangements, became even more heavily penetrated by the powerful United States monopoly groups. Comrade Dictionary has posted the definition of sanguinary in the chat, which is involving or causing much bloodshed. They lost heavily in the sanguinary campaigns that followed. Thank you, Comrade Dictionary. You were my only hope. Thanks. All right, so American finance capital, of course, had a field day in Germany during the post-war occupation. German industry and finance, already linked to American industry and finance by cartel and trust arrangements, became even more heavily penetrated by the powerful United States monopoly groups. The giant German banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Diskonto, Gesellschaft, Commerzbank, the mighty German trust, Krupp, Bayer, Badisch and Helen, and Soda Fabrik, Bosch and Siemens, or Simons, are all strong to American capital and in many ways subordinate to it. Italian banks and industry are in much the same position. The Banco Commerciale Italiano, Banco di Roma, Mediobanca, Credito Italiano are all in several ways tied up with American finance capital, either directly or indirectly. Examples can be stretched across the world to Japan, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This financial dependence upon America has been put by Lord Bierstead, chairman of M. Samuel and Company, at the 1963 annual meeting, when he reported the 16 2/3% acquisition of the company shares by the Morgan Group. In parentheses, we will not be the first merchant bank to have part of its capital owned by American interests. No, you won't. This Peiche's argument is a public confession of Europe's subservience to American finance monopoly, a monopoly expressed in the strategic and political alliances that bind European capitalism to American capitalism. European statesmen are deeply conscious of their inferior standing, but in the main feel there is little they can do to adjust the position. Resentment, however, there is, and in France it has expressed itself in General de Gaulle's stand on an individual French nuclear striking force, in his overtures to Adenauer, former German chancellor, and his attempts to exclude Great Britain from the common market as the long arm of the United States, and more recently in the overtures to China and his tour in Latin America. All these are efforts to arrest Americans' dominance of Europe and to exert French independent action on the international front. Such attempts, however, have little chance of success, nor can they make but a passing impression upon the world scene. They are in reality expressions of the deep competitive conflicts within capitalist alliances, or capitalist imperialism, which exists below the surface, federations and alliances, conflicts rooted in the unequal development of the contestants and the unequal development of capitalism. Britain, as the forerunner of the Industrial Revolution, became the first workshop of the world, the carrier of the world's goods, the foremost thruster for imperialist control from the city of London. Her decline set in with the upsurge of the younger, more vigorous capitalist states of Germany and against the older, established capitalist countries and against each other. The United States came out triumphant both times. Still, the city of London is only slowly giving way to Wall Street as the symbol of world money power. It hopes to resuscitate itself by spreading into the European common market, even though it must do so in alliance with and subordination to American financial monopoly. Surplus capital in France was more heavily invested in the less advanced countries of Europe, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, than that of either Britain or Germany. Although they too have large investments in the same European heavy industries, armaments, mines, and oil fields. Everybody, however, turned to the primary producing countries of the world, alienating such as outright colonies under political rule, subserving and exploiting others as spheres of investment on a semi-colonial pattern. Because of their late start, German and American capitalism pressed forward with the amalgamation of the industrial combines and the monopoly of finance capital more hurriedly than did either Britain or France, whose supremacy on the colonial plane assured their hegemony, interrelated at several points even while competitive on the international financial level. German financial monopoly took a beating in the defeat of 1918, when the colonial world was redivided, and again in 1945. American capitalism, on the other hand, owing to geographical and territorial advantages, the last inherent in its political union, continued to make rapid strides and was the real victor of both world wars. Expansion of American financial and industrial monopoly, however, was not confined to Europe. The balance of Western financial power began to tilt towards Asia and Africa, a process that has been speeded up since the end of the Second World War, with the breakdown of colonial rule. The many consortia which are being established in the majority of the new states revolve largely about the same financial and industrial groups that have rooted themselves firmly since the inception of colonial rule. Such changes as there are correspond with the changes of influence that have occurred within the groups themselves. The dominating influence is held by the ubiquitous American formations of Morgan and Rockefeller, with their British and European associates following behind. Neo-colonialism is reviving in the international coalitions of neo-colonialism. These coalitions of competing organisms reflect the global character that financial monopoly has attained under the dominance of the most powerful imperialism, that of America. They are also a sign of the struggle for survival of the older imperialisms against the fierce questing of the more powerful aggressiveness of American imperialism, whose vaster productive force is driving it outwards more and more. Attempts are made to sweeten the well-known aims of rapidly disintegrating political colonialism, the maintenance of less developed areas of the world as the providers of cheap raw materials, spheres of investment, and markets for expensive finished goods and services. The finished goods and services, now that the populations of the new nations are asserting demands for a rising standard of life, are taking on a different character and overspilling into categories formerly neglected. Land clearing equipment, hydroelectrical projects, road reconstruction, housing, schools, hospitals, harbors, airports, and all the ancillary and supplementary service they call for are providing new fields of capital investment and profit for financial monopoly, both at home and abroad. They are also keeping in handsomely paid employment, a large army of so-called experts, technical and professional people, not always at the highest caliber. New sources of extractive and agricultural commodities are also attracting large capital investment sums. Former dependence upon domestic sources of many minerals in the metropolitan countries is giving place to their importation from abroad. Miners in the copper and iron ore producing regions of the United States, for example, are being thrown out of work not only because of automation, but also because bigger profits are being obtained from the greatly stepped up mining of base materials in Africa and Asia. In some places, their semi-processing also offers greater margins that can be got in the areas of more expensive labor. Puerto Rico and other Latin American countries that offer cheap labor are fast becoming centers of manufactured consumer goods, frequently processed from imported raw materials and sent to the U.S. to compete with American-produced commodities at only slightly reduced or the same prices. This gives greater profits still to finance capital. Expand your markets, grow your profits. That seems to be their logic. The intricate process of balancing returns from domestic investment against the outflow of capital into more profitable foreign investment is creating serious rifts in the internal economic position of every Western capitalist country. This is felt particularly in the balance of payments position. Even the United States, whose reserves of gold and foreign exchange were so vast that they have carried her through a growing outward current over a long period, has now reached a stage when, like her less fortunate European counterparts, she is herself entering upon an adverse balance of payments crisis. Despite the rise in national production and increased productivity, the problems of agriculture, even in such rapidly rising economies as Western Germany, Italy, and France, bedeviled the economic situation. In America, the farming smallholder still lives close to and even below the poverty line, while the extensive mechanized farms or finance companies are spoon-fed by a banker's government. Guaranteed prices for produce that goes into government pay and government-built storages make large-scale farming in the United States highly profitable to finance capital. The United States highly profitable to finance capital, which passes on to the government that burdensome problem of what to do with unsold surpluses resulting from high prices. The need of further outlets for the products of agriculture as of the industrial and commercial complexes that are coming under increasing electronic control and hence acquiring a great increased potential is forcing Western capitalism, particularly American capitalism, into greater and more intensive involvement in highly industrialized foreign countries. The recent chicken farce played out against the background of de Gaulle's anti-American policy, which led Franco-German opposition to a continuation of cheaper American poultry importation into Europe. It's just one of the lighter examples of the fierce competition going on to unload the output of bank-financed, vigorously mechanized mass production. It highlighted for a moment the intrinsically paradoxical nature of the European market as a monopolistic organism putting up a strong resistance to a dominant competitive monopoly. The competitive tug of war is exemplified in the retaliative higher tariffs that have now been put upon French and German small cars imported into the United States, which have lost their main advantage over the home-produced article and the consequent higher price. Facts and figures prove that trade and investment between highly industrialized countries are outpacing those with the less developed region. They effectively support the case that imperialism is not confined to the primary producing sectors of the world. However, the salient fact is that the profit rate from the exploitation of the less developed areas is greater than that received from the more industrialized countries. In the latter, the competition between the monopolies is fiercest and domestic interests, even those which are linked with international finance monopoly, all the time offer the stoutest resistance to the invading ones. Yet, and this is precisely due to their imperialist character, the dominating world financial groups are able to make their constant incursions into the national monopolies, and so deepen their hegemony over larger and larger parts of the globe. How much easier then it is for imperialist finance to edge its way more and more into the developing countries where colonial rule is broken, or is breaking down. Under the necessity of seeking greater and greater capital sums for geological explorations and the opening up of new fields of extracted materials, international finance was called to the aid of the national finance of the respective imperialist countries. This process was stimulated by the fact that the national financial monopolies had already proceeded to the stage of international alliance with the onset of imperialism, a process that has manifoldly quickened in the present epoch of rising nationalism and socialism. Thus, at this present time, all the instruments and mechanics of international imperialism expressed in monopoly coalitions are brought to bear in a general descent upon the new needy countries. This new wave of predatory invasion of former colonies operates behind the international character of the agencies employed. Financial and industrial consortia, assistance organizations, financial aid bodies, and the like. Friendly cooperation is offered in the educational, cultural, and social domains, aimed at subverting the desirable patterns of indigenous progress to the imperialist objectives of the financial monopolists. These are the latest methods of holding back the real development of new countries. These are the paraphernalia of neo-colonialism, superficially proffering aid and guidance, subterraneously benefiting the interested donors and their countries in old ways and new ways. There are several definitions of aid, as B. Chango Machio in his Aid in Neo-colonialism has pointed out. We got to check that out at one point. The definition varies with different blocks. Thus, the own has its own definition. The imperialist camp has its own. So as the socialist camp and probably the non-aligned camp might also have one. But generally speaking, there are two main definitions, one by the UN and other as understood by the so-called donor countries. According to the UN, economic aid consists only of outright grants and long-term lending for non-military purposes by government and international organizations. By the so-called aid-giving countries include in the term aid, but the so-called aid-giving countries include in the term aid private capital, investment, and export credits, even for relatively short periods, as well as loans for military purposes. As Professor Benham in Economic Aid to Underdeveloped Countries remarks, it is pleasant to feel that you are helping your neighbors and at the same time increasing your own profits. Before the decline of colonialism, what today is known as aid was simply foreign investment. So that's chapter 3, y'all. Goddamn, Nkrumah had a lot to say there. This idea that he's starting to develop, and I'm really looking forward to taking a look at this aid and neo-colonialism, because that seems to be a relationship worth exploring. How aid is used for imperialism. I've heard of like missionaries being trained in this country and then being sent into other countries to like give away stuff like rice and other natural resources for free, so that markets can be undermined by like giving away the thing that it is you're selling. You know, like that shit is like wild how they do this shit in the name of, like we said, aid or helping the international community or whatever. Then we wonder why countries like Cuba and the DPRK don't fucking accept so-called aid from every fucking imperialist country that, you know, comes using that word. Because, like, you know, these motherfuckers know what the hell these imperialist countries are talking about when they say aid, and it's definitely not anything good for the working class of those countries, you know. Did anybody have any points they wanted to discuss before I continue on, before we wrap up? Because we finished chapter 3 already. Okay. So, no problem, Comrade Dictionary. So one of the things that was super interesting, so he said, American capitalism, on the other hand, owing to geographical and territorial advantages, continued to make rapid strides and was the real victor of both world wars. Expansion of American financial and industrial monopoly, however, was not confined to Europe. The balance of Western financial power began to tilt towards Asia and Africa, a process that has been sped up since the end of the Second World War with the breakdown of colonial rule. So, like, it's really interesting that we're talking about, I think neo-colonialism, the highest stage of imperialism, came out in the 60s, I want to say. And he's already talking about this, like, hyper, okay, so it's 1965 is when it gets published. And that's 75, 85, 95, 2005, 2015. That's 56 years ago now. And he's already talking about this, like, hyper acceleration of investment, you know, and how that necessarily begins to come into relationship with Africa and with Asia. And it's like super interesting to bring that up, because when you think about one of the talking points in like commie circles these days, one of the, you know, we get talked up is like China's relationship to Africa, and like whether or not its relationship necessarily is an imperialistic relationship, which obviously I would hope that that's not an imperialistic relationship. But you can see the fruits, or not the fruits, but like the origins of that relationship already starting to form here, because, you know, you said Western financial power began to tilt toward Asia and Africa. So, like, what does that mean materially? That means that the Western powers are beginning to so-called invest in Asia and Africa. And earlier in chapter 2, we had Nkrumah talking about how it didn't make sense for Africa to disengage from like any kind of relationship with European finance capital, because it's either facilitate development that way or be undermined by the colonialist and the imperialist and never be allowed to develop. But at the same time that's happening, we know for sure that like China is building a socialist project, and it is beginning to you have to pay attention to it on the world stage, and that necessarily ends up with, you know, over the next 50 years through a series of reform and, depending on who you ask, revisions by Comrade Deng and the CPC, ends up leading to China being the either leading imperialist power, which a position I don't agree with, or the leading socialist power in the world today, which is a position I definitely agree with. And that, like, because if what Nkrumah is saying here is true, China necessitates the first like opportunity that Africa has had under world imperialism to like engage in a relationship with another country, at least on that scale, that is not exploitative or coercive, or at the very least with the goal of whatever exploitation might exist to be dwindled down by the government and eventually eliminated, depending on the communist country we're talking about. That's definitely the perspective of Mozambique, for example. So that's a really interesting thing. He brought up the balance of Western financial power beginning to tilt towards Asia and Africa, because in 2021 we can definitely see how that's played out. So that was interesting for him to bring up. Yeah, those were my thoughts on like this chapter so far. Imperialist finance is, not the most interesting thing to talk about, but it definitely has like large scale world implications in terms of talking about imperialism, because this is the primary mode. And some so-called anti-imperialists out there will actually tell you that like the presence of imperialist finance would be why you don't see like emerging anti-imperialist powers that they would say are actually imperialist powers. They would say imperialist finance is why you don't necessarily see these countries engaging in colonialism, because according to such folks, the logic that's played out by Nkrumah here, talking about the exploitation and the way imperialism had developed up to 1965 and obviously beyond, that the way that had developed had already been violent, had already been genocidal and destructive, and necessarily meant that any other emerging power would not, once they found themselves engaging on the world stage, not having to engage in such a way. They can merely have conversations with the national bourgeois of other countries, is what these people would say, because the logic of imperialism had like already formed those relationships, and as such there's no need to get violent when you could just make a phone call. Like, I mean, obviously the flaw with that logic is in this idea that like the national bourgeoisie of all countries have the exact same interest, which is like kind of, I won't call it totally ahistorical, but it's not the most dialectical thing you could say, from the standpoint that like, the national bourgeoisie of a country that is, that emerged from like a country that existed under colonization and then decolonized would necessarily still have like colonization as a part of its national character. It could definitely be said to possibly have the interest of long-term working class interest in their mindset, or at the very least, it's more imaginable than the idea that like, what's the word I was about to say? It's definitely more imaginable than the idea that, oh yeah, it's not that these countries aren't evil. They're just engaging in finance capital because that's what the material conditions call for. Like, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the most accurate analysis. Zoe's on the stack. What's up, Zoe?
So yeah, the purpose of the state isn't just to mediate between, different competing classes under capitalism. It's mostly to mediate the interests of different bourgeois groups and the competition between them, because by the logic of capitalism, their entire existence is driven by competition with each other. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so like that necessarily means like, so like, because like I've been learning about that idea more so that recently, that there's like a factionalism within the bourgeois, where the bourgeois itself have like different elements that like compete against each other, which makes sense. Capitalism itself is a competitive superstructure, but like, does that mean that there would be interest among the bourgeois that are more aligned with the working class from a material perspective, and then there would be those who are totally just hyper driven by profit? Would there be bourgeois who have decolonization as like a goal, depending on like the country they're operating as bourgeois in, or would that like necessarily never play into the the character of a bourgeois person, even in a country that has been trying to achieve decolonization? Like, what do you think?
So what I think was that Mao's perspective on the national bourgeoisie was that the reason why they oppose the international bourgeoisie is because they want to have a clear, playing field to exploit the proletariat and the markets of their own country without being as beholden to foreign interests.
So that was China's national bourgeoisie's perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we don't see that being as much the case in Africa because, remember Wretched of the Earth, the national bourgeoisie there are carving out, an existence kind of on the margins in all these, trade operations.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, Comrade Dictionary is typing. Let's see what he has to say. That makes a lot of sense. Like, there's factionalism, and there would be bourgeois who don't necessarily have an interest in participating in this international, like, dividing up of the whole world. Which, like,
but yeah, I mean, regarding bourgeois factionalism, like, you can go to Congress's official website and look at the bills that are on the floor right now. And most of them are regarding, the mediation of corporate interests. Anyway, let's let Comrade Dictionary go.
It's on the stack. Yeah, that's good. Comrade Dictionary was good, big dog.
So what I was saying was that, to take another angle at the question you asked, Ho Chi Minh was originally a member of a nationalist party, explicitly nationalist, and he was not initially a communist. But through doing the work, he became a communist. So it is presumably possible for people who hold some like national interest to develop a communist output. And I therefore think it's probably possible for like bourgeois interests that are sort of like national bourgeoisie to have interests that then align with working class, even if they'll eventually betray them, like we saw in the October Revolution in Russia. I think it's plausible that we could see sections of the bourgeoisie that are more in line with things that would be good for the working class, even if ultimately they'll fight against the things that really need to be done, if I'm making sense.
Well, that makes perfect sense. You're talking about this idea that like interests can temporarily align, and as such, there could be alliances that are forged that like definitely emerge out of like whatever the perspective from any given bourgeoisie might be on like what the most important question at the time is. So like if they're imagining that like, yeah, it's going to be okay, it's going to be a good for us now to align with the like proletariat of our country against like this intervention or like this fascistic struggle inside of our country, then like they're going to do that even if that necessarily puts them at odds with the working class later. Like that totally makes sense. Is that about what you were getting at?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Hey, Zoe, you're on the stack again.
So just a quick point about the Russian Revolution. The reason why the bourgeoisie initially had a coalition government with the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries is because the bourgeoisie were a fairly weak and uninfluential group within Russia at the time. So they couldn't just straight up get rid of the socialists. They had to, have a coalition with them at the time, and the socialists were like actively trying to hand over power to the bourgeoisie because they were like, oh, Russia's a backwards feudal country. It has to have a bourgeois revolution, and then only later can we have a proletarian revolution. So that was what was keeping the bourgeoisie in power. And then the bourgeoisie started trying to starve out the socialist movement through lockouts and factory closures and that kind of stuff. So it's not a situation where the national bourgeoisie was ever on the side of the socialists. Yeah, they were just fighting at the time.
You saying at least not in Russia, huh? Well, you saying that was never the case in Russia? Yeah, okay.
In the Russian Revolution specifically.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So like the interest there were basically because so you're saying the socialists were handing power over to the bourgeoisie so like does that have to do with this idea that I've read about? What is that? It's like staged approach to revolution, where like history
right, exactly.
where things have to develop. Right, because what is it? You go from like
the SRs and the Mensheviks were like, really, rigid stages.
Mm-hmm.
And, they thought, okay, Russia can only go from, being this mostly feudal country to having a bourgeois revolution, and then the bourgeoisie has to hold power and develop the means of production, and only then can you have your proletarian revolution. And Lenin and Trotsky at the time were like, no, you can skip that whole nonsense and go straight to the proletarian revolution.
So what seems to have, like, from your perspective, have been like the material reality in terms of who ended up being right on that question?
So it was absolutely the Bolsheviks who were correct. So they did have to take a step back to a capitalist form of economy under the NEP.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, that was a temporary period of just, trying to get things back on the rails by any means possible. Because at this point, Russia had been completely demolished by World War I. The factories were in disrepair. There was no fuel. There was no raw materials. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a disaster. And then they got invaded by 14 different nations immediately afterward.
Yeah.
So Russia was like the biggest dumpster fire you can possibly imagine, and they had to do something. But it would have been worse if the bourgeoisie had, taken power, probably.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Gak says, why does that eerily sound like what's happening stateside now? What do you mean, Gak?
I mean, it's just what's basically happening now in the United States in terms of what we're seeing in our politics right now. Because many people who just pay attention to the surface of politics will say, oh, we couldn't have, and I hate to use socialist Democrats in this, SOC Dems rather, as an example here, but I still feel that it applies because, we couldn't have a SOC Dem in power back in 2016 because nobody was ready for it, and we couldn't have a SOC Dem in 2020 because he wasn't going to be able to be, Trump, the president at the time. And so, and in the meantime, all this is happening. It just feels as though the people just, are losing all their agency, are losing all their power. I mean, there's nothing that the average worker can do except, get, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 full-time jobs just to survive, just to keep their heads above the water. And that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really interesting point you made, Conrad, and I'm glad you made it. So, like, 2016, how hard I worked for Bernie back then, was going back on it retrospectively, like a very interesting time. Because, like, what do you have that's happening? And what are the, like, world conditions that, like, the Sanders campaign, its emergence, and its, like, success, even if it didn't ultimately win the presidency, ended up doing? You have world colonialism absolutely in crisis, in peril. You have Iran emerging as a possible anti-imperialist power, and like the logic of imperialism trying to like do everything it can to keep a stranglehold on Iran. During the Obama presidency, Libya had been destabilized through imperialist state action. You had obviously the 2009 economic crash. You had all kinds of crises internally. You had like the breaking down of like the police state inside the country, with protests breaking out left and right over this police murder and that police murder, or even just murder by civilians of other civilians in terms of like, Trayvon Martin. And so Bernie emerges from those conditions, right? And, he's given the wrong analysis of what the problems are. Because what is he attributing to the problems? Not world imperialism, not the exploitation of the global south. He's talking about like the wars are bad and we need to reinvest that money at home, and like we have to like do less greed, not no greed, just less greed, and that logic is like really appealing to people because at this time, in these like super exploitative conditions that we're all undering, and like this breaking down of capitalism that's happening all around us, it's the case that like people are just like in need of any kind of like change. People are like ready for change. Now it doesn't end up necessarily looking like that's the majority of people. Some people look like they were just like looking to like have a continuation of like the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. But because Bernie did not have a class analysis that was based around anti-imperialism, ending world exploitation, and eventually upending the continued mode of production that we currently have to live under, he ended up failing. And then, of course, you could talk about like bourgeois interference into that election, because from their standpoint, like even Bernie's like attempted intervention in like the state of affairs to like get capitalism on back on track wasn't worth like the temporary hit to the profits that they seem to have calculated would have resulted from his election, and that's why they had been with him. But when you look at 2019, it was a little different. Go back and watch the media coverage. The media coverage was a little bit more friendly, and definitely they were in the media. Don't get me wrong, was in the tank for Buttigieg and Harris and Biden and Klobuchar, but they were less averse to Biden this time or Bernie this time, because now the calculus seems to have been, a little hit to the profit motive is fine to get the imperialistic structure, back on the rails and functioning in a way that we can manage, making the imperialism less brazen and like stewing the seeds of revolution a little bit less blatantly, the way Trump would have done. So like Bernie was an acceptable alternative to like the bullshit this time around. And like that's one of the reasons why he pretty clearly would have been beaten Trump, not because he's like, this like great fucking candidate and the working class candidate is gonna always beat the opportunist, shamster like Trump is, because he's not a working class candidate. But the bourgeois had necessarily put all their resources behind this anybody but Trump. I said Trump kind of philosophy. And yeah, it could have meant Bernie if he gotten through, but there were enough sections of the bourgeois who wanted, a continuation of like the 8 years of Obama that conspired against Bernie, that like even with way less resistance, he still could not overcome. He could not overcome overcome things. Like he was undermined by a phone call this time. It took a hell of a lot more than that in 2016. So yeah, that's the analysis. Yeah. Did anybody else have any thoughts before we go ahead and wrap up?
I mean, isn't the current situation basically just everything Lenin describes in Chapter 1 of State and Rev?
Well, yeah, you're talking about in terms of like the rank and file opportunism and like the people like jockeying for position, in this to like try to like get a station as like this train totally fucking derails.
Yeah, and canonizing past radicals is, of previous, decades and centuries in the case of Marx as the harmless plaster icons of today.
Yeah, no, that's totally happened. I mean, for fuck's sake, they're liberalizing Fred Hampton of all things, and like trying to make the Rainbow Coalition seem less radical than it was. So they're definitely bastardizing the words. But for every bastardization of an accepted socialist, there's always like the emergence of one who they didn't want you to like realize wasn't as bad as the propaganda led to. That's why there's like this growing acceptance of Mao and Stalin and other comrades like that. But we're not here to get into a Stalin did no wrong argument or nothing along those lines. We're just saying the books.
Stalin did the best that anyone could have done.
Yeah, the books contradict the propaganda. That's what I'll tell the people who want to talk shit. So read the goddamn books. You know, read Dizzy with Success, read The National Question, read Materialism, Dialectical and Historic, and it's just like
Foundations of Leninism.
Yeah, just read that.
Don't forget Foundations of Leninism, especially Chapter 6.
Yeah, on The National Question, right? Yeah, for fuck's sake, y'all. Come on. Read the goddamn books. Anyways, as always, y'all, it's good to be here with y'all. We'll be continuing Walter Rodney tomorrow. We'll be continuing Michael Parenti on Saturday, and we'll be continuing Angela Davis on Wednesday. So, y'all got that to look forward to. Until then, y'all know I love y'all. Ta-ta for now, and I will see y'all tomorrow for Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.